I met Keith a couple of years ago when Keith was selecting a partner for some clubs he was working with. And in that last few years, he and I have grown to be pretty good friends and really like working together. So I'm excited to introduce to you Keith Catanzano.
Thanks, Blair, and thank you to everybody who is on our webinar today for taking a little bit of time out of your day to chat with us a little bit about how we have used different analytical techniques and the concept of big data specifically for the fitness industry and specifically in what we'll talk about today around retention. I work for a consulting firm here in Washington, D.C., co-founded a few years ago after working for probably about 15 years in the use of big data and analytics for really big companies. We co-founded 2River Consulting Group to specifically identify ways to bring those same techniques to smaller enterprises, mid-market enterprises. And so we've been really fortunate to work with a lot of club owners and operators over the last several years. We've probably worked with somewhere north of 100 clubs. And what I'd like to do today is just walk through, maybe over the next handful of minutes, some of the observations that we have had in hopes that it A, sparks a bit of a conversation, and B, helps you in what you do. This particular discussion is something that we call stop running in place. In other words, how can a focus on your data and your members help to shift the recruiting and the great sales activities that you're doing away from simply replacing lost members, which is expensive and you don't grow, and ultimately you're in some ways running in place. You've got a lot of data. I mean, everybody on this call, you're sitting in your club and you've probably got some form of a member management system running on a computer near you. And I know some of you have probably got different other support systems that are helping you with prospecting or scheduling and customer relationship management. And I suspect a lot of you are using Medallia or perhaps some other techniques for surveying your members to try to understand their view on their experience. You've got a lot of data, but it also can be hard to make sense out of. Thought about is how do you go from having so much information that it's kind of hard to get your arms around all of it to a point where you're truly getting lift from that data. You're really capitalizing it on a way that creates a unique advantage for you as a business and just a terrific experience for your members.
I can make just one quick comment about that, because that was one thing you really impressed upon me is that we all in the nature of our industry is that we have a right. I mean, it's a membership business. So somebody's got to check in. We know the time they check in. Good Lord, many times we know if they're connected to other family members in the club. A lot of us track, like if you buy a bottle of water for cash in our club, we put in your membership number. We know where you live. We know that if you're purchasing services. And one of the things I remember in a lot of our discussions was that in more transactional business, in less relationship-oriented, that we seem a little bit more like a B2B model. And in some more transaction-oriented businesses, they've had to build entire loyalty programs for two things. One, yes, it's great to get points and try to maintain some loyalty through some incentives. But two, that's how they go get information, right? I mean, and we actually have it just by the nature of our business, right? I mean, isn't that a big part of why this is such fertile ground for this type of big data practices?
Well, you're absolutely right, Blair. I mean, for anyone who stopped for a cup of coffee on your way into work this morning or went into a shop to buy something, that shopkeeper or that coffee shop that you stopped at, if they've got a loyalty program, then just Blair, as you mentioned, it is a good way to provide some rewards back to their customers, but B, it's a way for them to know who's buying what and when they're buying. And so they either had to create that program or they had to buy it to get the same kind of insight that you have almost by sort of default. So, what are some of the other challenges? Obviously, having a lot of data and figuring out what to do with it's one. The other one, though, is inherent to the industry. You may lose between 30 and 50% of your members per year. Another way that we also look at attrition, in addition to a 12-month average or a 30-day average, is we look at it over the course of a member's time since they joined. So the curves that you're seeing here, just to sort of orient you first off to the plot or the graph, it's the proportion of members that are still with a club after some period of time since they joined. So after 1 year, what proportion are still with the club? After 2 years, what proportion are still with the club? And so it's a way to look sort of across a member's life cycle and identify, are there points in a member's life cycle when attrition rises and falls, or when there may be a sharp drop off. What you see here, the fact that there are probably 8 or 10 different lines on the plot, those are unique segments of members, and each of those segments has a different rate at which they drop off, or they cancel their membership over the time that since they've joined. So just as an example, the pink line at the very bottom, what you can see there is half of those members who are in that particular group, in that particular segment. About half of them dropped after about 1.5 years of membership. So I wanted to introduce this way of looking at attrition because we're going to come back to it off and on throughout the presentation to just focus in on, are there any particular patterns that you might want to be aware of, and some ways in which you might want to be proactive about the members. One other challenge is the fact that it does take a lot of cost to recruit a new member, and quite frankly, if you're recruiting and you're selling just to replace the ones who are leaving, then ultimately you're spending a lot of money and you're spending a lot of energy to just keep membership levels basically flat. And so the funnel on the left probably looks somewhat similar to what you experience. Some of the data is based off of our research, some of the benchmarking that URSA has done. But when you look at the basic dynamics of it, you could certainly end up spending somewhere between $75,000 or $100,000 per club on advertising just to replace the members who have lost. So finding a way to curb that attrition is good in that it creates a great experience for members, and then it also allows you to get more out of the sales and the recruiting activities that you're doing instead of just replacing the lost members.
And Keith, and also to really understand, like when I went through my segment, and when I saw that last segment with the everybody quits in that segment, it has me thinking, good Lord, am I spending money? What does this group look like? Where do they consume information? How did I acquire them? Why am I wasting my money acquiring them if they're not even there long enough to get past my return on investment on that customer acquisition cost that you have on the second to the bottom line there? So my customer acquisition cost is $86, not excluding labor. And so I've got to get that. I've got to have people that can stay past that $86 mark just to get my return.
So Blair, that's a great point, and getting members to stay past that point at which you sort of recoup your costs, and you're right, this is just showing the advertising, your labor spend is on top of that, is really important, and so that's why it's important to understand, are there some particular dynamics, month to month after somebody has joined, for different membership segments. What you're seeing here on this particular chart is it's a model of attrition, and it looks at what is the attrition per month for each month after a member has joined. So what's the attrition 1 month after someone's joined, 2 months after they've joined, 3 months, and so forth. And you can see that we highlighted 4 areas where it is typical to see attrition start to rise up, to sort of peak. And we labeled them A, B, C, and D. It could be in that first group, somebody's a couple months into their membership, they're looking around and they're thinking, oh, this isn't working out the way I thought it would. Or I'm not building up, I'm not doing what I expected I would do when I first joined. And you can look at that second bar, the one labeled B, and it's right around the 12-month mark, which is probably a point where a lot of members say, well, I gave it a year, or for those who are in a contract that obligates them, this point at which that contract is up. And so, it's probably not too surprising for everyone who's really, kind of been in this business for a while to intuitively understand that there are those kinds of peaks and valleys in the first year. But it's also interesting to remember that those peaks and valleys can also show up 2-3 years out. And so you can see in some of the later marks where we have found very typically in a lot of clubs some peaks just past the 3-year mark and the 4-year mark where, quite frankly, it could be members saying, I'm not using it, I haven't used it for a while, I didn't want to quit right away because I really did want to make a commitment to my fitness, but I gave it another 12 months or I gave it, however much longer, and I'm still not using it. And so, this is important for a couple of reasons. One is when you look at your own data, if you find these kinds of peaks and valleys, then you can start to be proactive and get ahead of it. And if you find that there are certain groups where that first peak might be shifted a little to the left, well then quite frankly you might have a rise in attrition before you've even fully recouped your costs of acquiring that member, Blair, to your earlier point. And so that would be a really important group to focus on, either A, no longer recruiting them in your advertising, or B, finding out why they're leaving and see if you can shift that to the right. So it's an important, we feel like this is an important way to look at just looking at your data so that you can understand where are there some natural tendencies for attrition to rise, and then what you can do with that is you can start to be proactive instead of reactive.
And Keith, if I remember right, like this pattern is fairly consistent across different types of clubs as well. As a matter of fact, I think this pattern was fairly consistent with our clubs, and we have all month-to-month memberships.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Like I said, we've probably looked, maybe around 120 or so clubs. We see some version of this in almost every one. I can't think of any off the top of my head. I'm sure there is, there's probably one out there. Obviously, some clubs, those peaks shift a little to the left or a little to the right. Some might be a little steeper. And yeah, Blair, you're absolutely right. When we did the diagnostic on your club, you had some of these as well. And again, I think that there's just some human nature that drives some of this, that is above and beyond the experience that you create, and part of it's, did they come to you with a workout habit? Were they able to develop one? So what do you take from that? Again, I take a couple things away from it. One is depending on your margins and the cost for your actual member acquisition, you can have, maybe it's a 6-month, 9-month payback period, and yet you can see from that last chart that there are a lot of new members who are at a high risk of attrition in that same 6 or 9 month window. So finding ways to tackle that is not just good for making sure they have a great experience, but it's good for making sure that the business and the the economics of bringing in those new members, that you're getting that return. And if you can get those members to build the kind of workout habit and stay past the first year, what you may have also noticed in the curves is that once you get past the year, yeah, there were some blips up there at, I think in that case years 3 and 4, but attrition was a lot lower. So, what are the ways to not only keep them through the payback period, but to keep them through that 1 year point, which is really a key milestone in terms of then having members stay with you for long periods of time. And then finally, obviously, the other takeaway is once you've kept somebody past the 1 year, you've recouped your upfront acquisition costs. Keeping them is a lot more valuable than replacing him or her, because you are at a point where you've already paid back your upfront costs, and so it's a lot more of a profitable member. We feel like retention programs have really got to be targeted. You've got a lot of members. A lot of them are going to leave no matter what you do. And so, being targeted and focused is important. Otherwise, you're going to, potentially spend more than you save.